At my wedding, the happiest day of my life turned into a nightmare within seconds. My father stood up, his voice booming across the room. "He's not my son. A bastard like him doesn't deserve a wedding gift." The room froze. I froze. Every eye turned toward me, and I felt the ground slip away beneath my feet. Shame, pain, disbelief, it all crashed down at once. For 30 years I had carried scars from this man's cruelty, but never did I imagine he would choose my wedding day to cut me open in front of everyone. And just when I thought my world had collapsed for good, my grandmother slowly rose from her seat. She carried an envelope, her hands steady, her gaze sharp as steel. She walked straight to my father, and when he opened it, his face went pale, his hands trembling, and his heart stopped cold. What truth could be so devastating it shattered him on the spot? What secret had been buried for decades, waiting for this very moment to explode? Stay with me, because this story isn't just about humiliation. It's about revenge, hidden lies, and a shocking twist that turned my life upside down. If you've ever wanted to see justice served in the most unexpected way, you'll want to hear every word of what happened next. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join me, because I promise this is one story you will never forget. My name is Michael Turner. I am 30 years old now, a software engineer living in Pittsburgh, but before I found my way here, my story began in a small, fading industrial town in Pennsylvania. People who see me today might notice the quiet determination in my face, or the way I pause before I speak, as though weighing every word. What they cannot see is the childhood I carried with me, the shadows that shaped me long before I stepped into adulthood. That childhood is where this story truly begins. The town where I grew up was once a proud place. Decades earlier, the factories along the river employed nearly everyone's father and uncle, filling the air with the heavy smell of steel and smoke. By the time I came into the world, those factories were shutting down one by one, and what remained was a community that survived on old pride and fading opportunity. My father, Richard Turner, was one of the few men who managed to hold on to status. He ran a small but steady construction business and walked through town with the air of someone who had outlasted the collapse. To everyone else, he looked like a man in control. To me, he looked like someone who had locked his heart away. My mother, Rosemary, died when I was barely 2. I never knew the sound of her laugh, the touch of her hand smoothing my hair. All I had of her were faded photographs tucked into drawers and the rare whispered memory from my grandmother, Margaret. Father remarried quickly, too quickly for the neighbors not to notice, though no one dared question him. Elaine was his choice, a woman from a wealthy family whose fortune cushioned the town's decline. Where others were losing jobs, Elaine's family had investments. Where others worried about mortgages, Elaine wore pearls. To the outside world, Elaine was perfect. She knew how to smile just enough to tilt her head in sympathy when neighbors spoke of lost jobs. In church, she sang hymns with a soft voice, hands folded like a saint. But within the walls of our house, the mask slipped. I was a reminder of a woman she could never erase, a ghost she resented. Her words stung worse than slaps. Freeloader, burden bastard. I learned those names before I learned multiplication. I was a quiet child, watchful. I tried to stay out of her way, tiptoeing through the rooms so as not to disturb the silence she demanded. Still, every mistake was magnified. If I spilled a drop of milk, her scorn came sharp and cutting. If I forgot to take off my shoes at the door, her glare froze me where I stood. My father never defended me. He would watch with those cold eyes and then simply turn away, as though I was someone else's problem. The house itself seemed to echo their judgment. It was a grand old Victorian on a corner lot, white paint kept immaculate for appearances, lace curtains always crisp. Inside, though, it felt less like a home and more like a stage where I was always cast in the wrong role. The polished floors never creaked under David's footsteps, only mine. Elaine adored David, her son, with Richard, who arrived not long after their marriage. From the moment he could walk, he was showered with affection, new toys, and the kind of tender words I longed for. I remember once standing at the top of the staircase watching Richard scoop David into his arms. David's laughter rang out bright and free as Richard spun him in a circle. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath, hoping maybe Richard would look up and call for me too. He never did. Instead, he carried David into the parlor where Elaine waited with a camera capturing the perfect family moment, one where I was conspicuously absent. As a boy, I could not understand what I had done wrong. I studied harder than David, I worked at my chores, I tried to earn even a nod of approval. But love in that house was a currency I could never access. My place was not beside them, but on the periphery, watching, wishing. It was during one of those long nights, lying in bed with the sound of the old radiator hissing, that I first overheard a fragment of truth. Through the thin walls, I heard Richard's voice, low and tense. Elaine's reply came sharp, almost a hiss. "Don't you dare bring up the past again. Some things are better buried." I froze under my blanket, staring into the dark, past buried. At that age, I didn't know what it meant, but the words clung to me like burrs. That was not the last time. On more than one occasion, I caught Richard and Elaine speaking in hushed tones when they thought I was out of earshot. Their conversations always seemed to circle back to something left unsaid, a shadow stretching across their voices. Whenever I walked into the room, the air snapped shut, conversation ending abruptly, Elaine's smile plastered back into place. The older I grew, the more the differences between David and me hardened into something I could not ignore. He was the golden child taken to the county fair, dressed in new clothes each school year. I was the boy who wore hand-me-downs until the knees tore, the boy who was asked why I could not be more like David. Teachers would see Richard at David's football games, never at my parent-teacher conferences. I learned early that whatever pride my father had, none of it extended to me. Yet despite everything, there were moments when I still longed for his approval. I would linger in the doorway while he worked in his office, hoping he might glance up and ask about my day. Instead, he would sigh and say, "Shut the door, Michael." That dismissal was heavier than any insult. Looking back now, I realize those years were shaping me in swints. Each slight, each name Elaine hurled at me, each cold shoulder from Richard, those were chisels carving into my sense of self. I carried invisible scars that no one in town could see because to them we were still the Turners. A family respected for our tidy lawn and Richard's steady business. Appearances were everything. Truth was locked away, waiting for a moment I did not yet imagine. One memory remains fixed in my mind, as clear as the smell of coal smoke that used to hang in the air. I was about 10, standing at the window in the upstairs hall. Outside, Richard was in the yard, lifting David into the air, his face split in a rare, wide smile. Elaine stood nearby, clapping her hands, calling David her little prince. I pressed my forehead to the glass, my breath fogging the pain. Inside my chest, a question pulsed heavier than my heartbeat: why not me? That question would follow me for years, threading through every choice, every fear, every hollow ache. I didn't know it then, but the answer was far more complicated and far more devastating than I could have ever imagined. The memory of watching my father lift David into the air stayed with me like a bruise that never faded. From that moment forward, I noticed every detail of the difference in how we were treated. It wasn't just the absence of affection that cut into me, but the punishments that arrived when I least expected them. Elaine seemed to find reasons to unleash her anger, and Richard, if he was there at all, turned his back as if my pain were none of his concern. One evening stands out clearer than most. I had been told to dust the living room shelves before guests arrived. I was careful, inching along with a rag clutched in my small hand, but a porcelain figurine wobbled and fell. It did not shatter, only chipped, but that was enough. Elaine's footsteps thundered across the floor. She snatched the rag from me and with a swift motion slapped me hard across the face. The sound cracked through the room like a whip, and I stumbled back, the metallic taste of blood rising where my lips split against my teeth. My cheek burned hot, my ears rang. Richard was in the doorway, briefcase still in hand. And for a heartbeat I thought he might step forward. Instead, he sighed heavily, shook his head, and walked away. That moment taught me more than words ever could. I was on my own. The wounds weren't always physical. Some cut deeper. Each year when my birthday came around, the day passed without notice. No cake, no candles, no wrapped presents waiting on the dining room table. I remember my 10th birthday especially. I sat alone in my room, listening to laughter downstairs as Elaine planned David's party for the following week. When David's day came, the house swelled with balloons, music, and the smell of frosted cake. Friends crowded in with brightly wrapped boxes while Richard filmed every moment with his camera, pride etched into his smile. I lingered at the edge of the doorway, hoping someone might remember me, but not a single person looked my way. The contrast carved itself into my memory, my silence against David's celebration. School offered no escape. Children are sharp-eyed, and they sensed weakness the way wolves scent blood. Whispers followed me through hallways, bastard, unwanted mistake. Some days a classmate would mutter it loud enough for me to hear, grinning as if daring me to fight back. I never did. I lowered my head, endured the jeers, and carried the shame home with me. The cruelty of children reflected the cruelty I knew at home, confirming what I already feared: I did not belong. I remember sitting at lunch tables where chairs filled quickly around David while the seat beside me remained empty. Loneliness pressed in from every direction, and I began to believe the names they gave me. Elaine knew how to twist the knife further. When I tried to speak of the unfairness, her voice dripped with false concern. "Michael, you're imagining things. No one hates you. You're too sensitive." Those words confused me, left me doubting my own perceptions. Was I inventing it? Was the sting on my cheek not real? Gaslighting, though I didn't know the word then, was her sharpest weapon. It made me mistrust myself, eroding the little confidence I clung to. I found myself apologizing even when I hadn't done anything wrong, desperate to avoid her scorn. One afternoon, while I sat on the porch steps tying my shoes, David wandered over with the careless honesty of a child. He looked at me with a smirk and said, "Dad said you're not really my brother." The words struck me harder than any slap. My fingers froze on the laces and I stared at him, but he had already run off to chase a ball across the yard. The sentence echoed inside me long after the sound of his laughter faded. I wanted to believe he misunderstood, that he had made it up, but deep down a seed of doubt sprouted. What if it were true? That night I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling. The radiator clanked and hissed, shadows stretched long across the walls, and in the silence I heard David's voice again and again. I whispered into the darkness as though asking the question aloud might summon an answer. Am I really not his son? No reply came, only the hum of the old house and the ache of a truth I wasn't yet ready to face. The words I whispered into the darkness, questioning if I was truly my father's son, lingered with me through the weeks that followed. In the house on Catherine Street, silence was my companion, coldness my inheritance. But there was one place where the air felt lighter, where shadows didn't seem to press so heavily against my chest. Every Friday evening, when Elaine and Richard were occupied with their own affairs, I was sent to my grandmother Margaret's farm on the edge of town. To them it was a convenient arrangement, a way to keep me out of the way. To me, it was salvation. The moment I stepped off my bicycle and into the gravel drive of her property, the world shifted. The cracked wooden gate, the faded red paint peeling on the barn, the rows of vegetables swaying in the breeze, all of it welcomed me like an embrace, and then there was the smell. Before I even reached the porch, the scent of apple pie would drift through the open window, warm and rich, clinging to the air as though it had been waiting just for me. That smell was home in a way no polished Victorian mansion could ever be. Grandma Margaret would be there at the door, apron dusted with flower, arms outstretched. She hugged me tight, her embrace firm and trembling at once, as though she feared if she let go I might vanish. In those arms I was not a burden, not a mistake, not a bastard. I was simply her grandson, cherished without condition. I can still remember pressing my cheek against the soft cotton of her dress, breathing in the faint scent of soap and cinnamon, and feeling a calm I never knew elsewhere. Evenings at the farm were filled with small comforts that glowed brighter against the backdrop of my week. I would sit at her kitchen table, the wood worn smooth by years of use, while she ladled steaming pumpkin soup into my bowl. The crackle of the wood stove filled the silence with a rhythm that soothed me. Outside, the wind rustled through the corn stalks, a sound like whispering voices that carried no malice, only peace. Sometimes, when I lay in the small bed she kept ready for me, I could hear the chickens shifting in their coop and the distant hoot of an owl. Unlike the silence of my father's house, which pressed down heavy and suffocating, the silence here was alive, filled with the gentle music of the countryside. I felt safe, as though the walls of her little farmhouse formed a barrier that kept out the cruelty of the world. Grandma often spoke of my mother Rosemary, though never in long stories. Her voice would soften as she recalled the way Rosemary sang while she worked in the kitchen, or how her smile could brighten even the gloomiest days. I clung to those fragments, trying to weave them into a picture of the woman I never knew. Yet whenever I pressed for more, for why she had seemed so sad or why her life had ended so soon, Grandma's words would falter. Her eyes would cloud, her hands still. "Some things are too heavy for you now, Michael," she would say, and then she would change the subject, perhaps offering another slice of pie as a distraction. Her evasions planted questions in my mind that grew restless with each passing year. Why did she avoid speaking of my mother's pain? Why did her face carry such sorrow whenever Rosemary's name was mentioned? I didn't have answers, but I carried the weight of the silence like a stone in my pocket. One afternoon, curiosity led me farther than I intended. Grandma had gone out to tend the garden, leaving me inside to read at the table. The late sun streamed through the curtains, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. I wandered into her bedroom, a space usually off limits, drawn by an impulse I couldn't resist. On the nightstand was a drawer slightly ajar, and through the crack I saw the edge of a photograph. I hesitated, then pulled it free. The photo was old, its edges curled. It showed my mother Rosemary, younger than I had ever seen her in other pictures. Her golden hair shone in the light, her smile radiant yet tinged with something unreadable. Beside her stood a man I did not recognize. He was tall, with dark hair and a gaze that seemed both gentle and strong. They stood close, shoulders nearly touching, as though they belonged together. My breath caught. Who was he? Before I could study the photo longer, I heard the creak of the floorboards behind me. Grandma's voice came sharp with alarm. "Michael, what are you doing?" She snatched the picture from my hands. Her face pale. For a long moment she stared at me as if deciding what to say. Then with trembling fingers she tucked the photograph back into the drawer and closed it firmly. "That's nothing for you to worry about," she said, her tone sadder but final. I wanted to protest, to demand an answer, but the look in her eyes silenced me. It was a look of both fear and sorrow, a look that told me the truth was locked away for reasons I was too young to understand. That night, as I lay in the small bed under the patchwork quilt she had sewn, I couldn't shake the image of that man standing beside my mother. His presence burned into my thoughts. Who was he to her? Why had Grandma hidden his picture? My mind spun with questions that had no answers. The wind outside rattled the window panes, the smell of apples still lingering faintly from the day's baking. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness just as I had done so many nights before, but this time the question was different. Who was that man? The silence gave no reply, but the question stayed with me, embedding itself deep in my heart, waiting for the day when the truth would finally break free. Turning 18 should have felt like a door opening, a step into freedom. But for me, it began as a day weighed down with unease. The farm smelled of wood smoke and rain that morning, and I arrived to find my grandmother sitting by the fireplace, her hands folded tightly around a smooth wooden block. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had spent the night in tears. I paused in the doorway, feeling the air grow heavy with something unspoken. "Sit with me, Michael," she said softly, her voice trembling. I obeyed, my pulse racing. She pushed the box toward me, the wood worn smooth by time, the hinges tarnished. "This belongs to you now. You're old enough to know." I opened the lid with uncertain hands. Inside were a few letters yellowed by age and a photograph that froze me in place. My mother stood in the frame, younger than I had ever seen her, her smile bright despite a shadow of sorrow in her eyes. Beside her was the man I had glimpsed once before in Grandma's drawer, the man she had hidden away. His arm brushed hers, their closeness speaking of a bond far deeper than friendship. I looked up at my grandmother, searching her face for answers. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "That man is Caleb. He was your mother's love, and he was your real father." The words shattered something inside me. My chest tightened, heat rushing through my veins. "What are you saying?" My voice cracked louder than I meant. "All these years." "Lies." I slammed the box down on the table, the contents scattering. The sound rang through the room, startling even me, but I couldn't stop. Anger surged, too strong, born of years of confusion and neglect. She reached for me, her hand trembling. "I thought I was protecting you. Your mother was forced into marrying Richard, my doing in part. I thought it would give her stability, a future. I was wrong, so wrong." Her confession spilled out in sobs, words torn from a heart carrying guilt for decades. I wanted to comfort her, yet my own fury and grief burned too bright. "And Richard," I demanded, "did he know?" Grandma lowered her eyes. "Yes. He knew from the beginning that you weren't his blood. But pride and reputation mattered more than truth. He chose silence. He chose cruelty. He made you pay for a sin that wasn't yours." I staggered back as if struck. All the years of cold stares the word bastard hurled at me suddenly snapped into place. He had despised me not because of what I did, but because of what I represented. A reminder of betrayal, of a truth he wished buried. I clenched my fists, feeling the weight of injustice pressed down like never before. My grandmother's tears flowed freely. "I should have told you sooner. I should have fought harder for you. Your mother loved Caleb. They would have given anything to be together, but I tore them apart. And when she died, I let you live in that house thinking you'd have a better chance with Richard's name. Instead, you suffered." Her shoulders shook with the force of her regret. I wanted to scream, to demand why she hadn't saved me. But the sight of her frailty softened something in me. She had carried this burden for years, perhaps thinking silence was mercy. Still, the pain she had unleashed inside me could not be contained. I turned back to the scattered contents of the box, my hands trembling as I picked up the photograph. The man Caleb looked back at me with eyes that seemed almost familiar. Was it possible that in his face I saw pieces of myself, features Richard never shared with me? My throat tightened. Grandma hesitated before speaking again. Her voice, lower now, weighted with another secret. Michael, there is something else. Years ago I saw Elaine with another man, not Richard. They were together in a way that left no doubt. I never told Richard, but I've carried that memory all this time. I think she has her own secrets buried like ours. Her words added another crack to the fragile structure of my world. If Elaine was unfaithful, then the family image Richard clung to so desperately was nothing more than a brittle facade. My mind spun with the implications, but my heart was already drowning in too much revelation to absorb more. That evening, when the fire had burned low and my grandmother had fallen asleep, I sat alone at the table. The box lay open before me, its secrets exposed, its weight heavier than stone. My hands shook as I held the photograph again, staring at the man who was my father in truth, though never in name. The room felt unbearably still. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls of the farmhouse, rattling the windows like an impatient hand. My chest ached with a hollowness I could not name. I whispered into the silence, my voice breaking as though afraid of the answer. If I'm not his son, who am I? The only reply was the steady ticking of the clock on the mantel, each second marking the end of the life I thought I knew, and the beginning of one I had yet to face. The question that had haunted me since childhood now pressed against my chest with unbearable force. The photograph of Caleb, my mother's true love, was still seared into my memory when I walked back into the house on Catherine Street. The walls seemed taller, colder, the air thick with the tension I carried inside me. I found my father in his study, the heavy curtains drawn, the smell of his cigar lingering in the stale air. My heart pounded, but the words burst out before fear could stop me. Am I really your son? Richard lifted his eyes from the ledger on his desk, his face unreadable at first. For a fleeting second I thought he might deny it, might tell me I was mistaken, that blood still bound us. But his gaze hardened into steel. His voice was cold, deliberate, every word chosen like a knife. You were never mine. The silence that followed was deafening. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me, my stomach hollowing out as though I had been struck. I gripped the door frame, my breath ragged, waiting for him to take it back to soften. He did not. His eyes lingered on me with the same disdain I had felt all my life, now sharpened by confirmation. Behind me, Elaine's laugh rang out sharp and cruel. She had been listening from the hallway, and now she stepped forward, her arms folded. Satisfaction painted across her face. See, Michael, she said, savoring each word. Even he admits it. You don't belong here. You never did. David leaned against the wall nearby, older now, with the smug confidence of someone who had always been chosen. He smirked, a faint chuckle slipping from his lips, and it cut through me worse than any insult. That smirk told me everything he had known, or at least suspected, all along. My fists clenched. Rage boiled through me, a fury born of years of silence, neglect, and cruelty. I stepped toward Richard, my voice shaking with all the pent-up pain. You let me suffer here. You let her call me names. You knew the truth and still treated me like dirt. All these years you stood by and let it happen. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he rose, his frame towering, his shadow swallowing mine. For a brief moment we stood eye to eye, father and not son, the air charged with hatred. Then with a sudden shove he pushed me backward. I stumbled, the corner of the desk catching my hip, and crashed to the floor. Pain shot up my side, but the wound that hurt most was deeper, carved into my soul. Elaine laughed again, the sound echoing like glass breaking. David shook his head, his grin widening. Pathetic, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. I pulled myself up slowly, every muscle trembling, and looked at the three of them. The man who denied me, the woman who despised me, the brother who mocked me. In that moment, the weight of my life in that house became unbearable. I understood that staying meant death by inches, the slow erosion of everything I was. Leaving meant stepping into the unknown, but it was the only way forward. Without a word, I went to my room. The walls there were bare, stripped of any comfort. I pulled out an old backpack from the closet and began filling it with the only things I truly owned: a change of clothes, a notebook, and the photograph of my mother. I held that picture for a long moment, her smile fragile but real, and whispered a promise to her image. I'll make something of myself. I'll live for you. Voices carried faintly from downstairs, Elaine's sharp tone, Richard's low rumble, David's laughter. None of them came to stop me. Perhaps they thought I wouldn't have the courage to go. Perhaps they didn't care. I slung the backpack over my shoulder, my pulse steady now. As I walked down the hall for the last time, I glanced at the family portraits lining the wall, Richard with Elaine and David smiling for the camera, the perfect facade. I was nowhere in those frames. It struck me then how fitting it was. At the front door, I placed my hand on the knob, the wood worn smooth from years of use. My chest rose and fell with one final breath. Then I opened the door wide, stepped into the cool night, and pulled it shut behind me with a force that rattled the glass panes. The sound echoed down the empty street like a gunshot. I will never come back, I swore into the darkness. The vow clung to the air, heavy and unbreakable, as I walked away from the house that had never been a home. The night I closed the door on my father's house, I stepped into a life of uncertainty. I had no clear plan beyond survival, only the determination never to return. That determination carried me to Pittsburgh, where I applied to the university, with little more than my transcripts and the stubborn belief that I could forge a new path. The admissions office required proof of financial hardship, and I laid my entire story bare. My mother gone, my father denying me the years of neglect. It was humiliating to write it all down, but those words became my lifeline. Against the odds, I was awarded a scholarship. Without it, college would have been impossible. The University of Pittsburgh was a bustling place, alive with students whose families supported them, who walked into class wearing clean clothes and carrying new laptops. I stood among them with thrift store shirts and a used notebook, feeling like an imposter. I rented a cramped studio apartment near campus, its single window overlooking an alley. The rent drained what little money I had left, and soon I was surviving on cheap instant noodles, the kind that left me hungry again within an hour. To keep afloat, I worked nights at a small diner near the student district. The fluorescent lights hummed the air, heavy with the smell of grease and coffee. I wiped tables until my hands ached and carried plates until my arms felt like lead. When my shift ended after midnight, I would stumble back to my apartment only to wake up early for class. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My grades began to slip. My vision blurred from exhaustion, and more than once I considered dropping out. One afternoon, the weight of it all caught up with me. I had stopped at a cafe between classes, hoping a cup of coffee would keep me awake long enough to finish an assignment. I barely managed to place my order before the room spun, the floor tilted, and I collapsed. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on a stiff bed in the emergency room, a monitor beeping steadily at my side. A young woman with dark hair and kind eyes sat nearby, a worried expression softening her face. "You scared everyone back there," she said gently. "I'm Emily. I brought you here." Her voice carried warmth I hadn't heard in years. Embarrassment burned in me as I realized a stranger had seen me at my weakest. Yet gratitude overwhelmed it. She stayed until the doctor discharged me, making sure I was steady on my feet. Before she left, she pressed a small note into my hand with her phone number. "Don't try to carry everything alone," she said. I slipped the note into my pocket, her words lingering long after she walked away. In the weeks that followed, I forced myself to keep moving. I found an on-campus flyer for a support group for survivors of abuse. At first, I hesitated. Speaking about my childhood felt dangerous, like reopening a wound that had only just scabbed over. But the weight inside me had become too heavy to bear alone. I went to a meeting, sitting in a circle of folding chairs among strangers. When my turn came, I stumbled through my story, my hands shaking. Yet no one laughed. No one dismissed me. Heads nodded, eyes filled with understanding. For the first time, I felt less alone. Those meetings became a quiet anchor. I learned to name what had happened to me. Neglect, emotional abuse, gaslighting, and in naming it, I began to loosen its hold. Each week I walked out of that room a little lighter, even if the journey ahead still loomed long and hard. One evening, after a particularly brutal week of exams and double shifts, I returned home to find a letter waiting in my mailbox. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky but unmistakable. Grandma Margaret. I tore it open and unfolded the cream-colored paper. "My dear Michael," it read, "I know the road feels unbearable at times, but remember, you are stronger than you think. Your mother's spirit lives in you, and so does my love. Do not give up. You have already survived the worst." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I sank onto my bed, the letter pressed against my chest, and for the first time in weeks I let myself weep. But beneath the tears was a spark, a fragile determination that flared brighter with each word I reread. I whispered aloud into the dim room, "I will not give up." The letter trembled in my hands, but my resolve steadied. I knew then that no matter how hard the road ahead became, I would keep walking. Emily's note had stayed in my pocket for days before I finally found the courage to use it. The memory of her sitting by my hospital bed replayed in my mind whenever exhaustion threatened to pull me under. One afternoon, when the weight of loneliness became too much, I dialed her number. To my surprise, she answered on the first ring, her voice bright and warm as if she had been waiting. We met for coffee, and what I thought would be a brief thank you turned into hours of conversation. Those meetings became a rhythm. Sometimes we sat in the park with paper cups of tea, other times she visited me at the diner during my break. I learned she carried her own scars, though different from mine. She had lost both her parents in a car accident when she was a teenager, and had been raised by an aunt who did her best but could never replace the love she had lost. Her eyes softened when she told me this, and I felt an ache in my chest. Here was someone who understood the hollow space grief carved inside a person. The more time we spent together, the more natural it felt. She laughed easily, a sound that seemed to clear the fog in my mind. She asked about my studies, about the books I read, about what I dreamed of becoming. Yet whenever she gently steered the conversation toward my past, I would retreat. A wall rose in me, built from years of shame and fear. One evening, as we walked along the Allegheny River, the tension broke. Emily asked me why I always changed the subject when she mentioned family. Her tone wasn't harsh, but my defenses flared. "Because it doesn't matter," I snapped, harsher than I intended. "You don't need to know everything." Her steps slowed, her expression moved. "Michael, I'm not asking because I want to pry. I'm asking because I care." The words hung in the cool night air, and guilt pressed down on me. But pride kept me silent. We walked in uneasy quiet until she stopped, turning to face me. "You push people away before they have the chance to hurt you." but not everyone wants to hurt you." The truth in her voice stung. I looked away, staring at the water glinting under the streetlights. She waited for me to answer, and when I didn't, she finally whispered, "Maybe you're not ready to trust me." Then she walked off, leaving me rooted on the path, the distance between us stretching wider with each step. For days after her absence gnawed at me. I kept replaying the moment, wishing I had reached out, wishing I had let her see the pain I buried. Finally, unable to bear it, I went to her apartment. She opened the door cautiously, surprise flickering across her face. I stumbled through an apology, words tumbling out, but she cut me off with a gentle firmness. "You don't have to apologize for being hurt," she said, "but don't hide from me. You're not broken, Michael, you've survived. That doesn't make you less, it makes you strong." Her hand found mine, then warm and steady, and the dam inside me cracked. The fear of rejection, the shame of my past, the voice that told me I wasn't worth loving. They all fought to hold me back, but her touch silenced them. In that moment, I felt seen in a way I never had before. In the days that followed, something shifted. I laughed more, slept a little easier, and found myself looking forward to every chance we had to meet. Yet still, a part of me held back the deepest truth. The photograph of my mother and Caleb remained hidden in my backpack, a reminder of the secret that defined me. One evening after dinner at her place, I knew I couldn't keep it hidden any longer. My hands shook as I pulled out the photo, placing it on the table between us. Emily studied it quietly, her eyes moving from my mother's smile to the man standing beside her. "That's my mother," I said, my voice unsteady. "And that man, Caleb, he was her true love, my real father. Richard knew, and he hated me for it. That's why." I trailed off, fear tightening my throat. I forced the words out. "Do you still want me knowing this?" The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. My heart pounded so hard it drowned out my breath. Then Emily looked up, her gaze steady, and nodded once. It was simple, but it carried the weight of everything I had been too afraid to believe. The evening after Emily accepted the truth of my past, we turned our attention to planning the future. Neither of us had much money, so we kept the wedding simple, letting love be the centerpiece instead of grandeur. We chose a quiet spot by the river, a place where the water reflected the sky like glass, and borrowed chairs from neighbors and friends. Strings of fairy lights hung between the trees, and jars filled with wildflowers lined the aisle. It wasn't the kind of wedding that filled magazines, but it was ours. And that made it more beautiful than anything money could buy. On the day itself, the autumn air carried a faint chill, but the sky was clear. Guests gathered in small groups, their laughter blending with the rustle of leaves. I wore the same suit I had saved up for years earlier, now carefully pressed, and Emily walked toward me in a dress her aunt had sewn, each stitch made with love. When she reached me, I felt the world still, as though the river itself had paused to honor our moment. At the front row sat Grandma Margaret, her hands clasped together, tears shining in her eyes. She smiled at me with such pride and tenderness that my chest ached. This was the woman who had carried me through storms, who had been the only light in years of darkness. Seeing her there beaming through tears was the greatest gift I could have asked for. For a while everything was perfect. Then I saw them. Richard, Elaine, and David appeared at the edge of the gathering, their presence like a shtu across the sunlight. My chest tightened as if the air itself had grown heavy. I hadn't sent them invitations. I hadn't wanted them here. Before I could react, David stepped forward holding a folded piece of paper. His voice was low but steady as he said, "I invited them. I thought maybe this could be a chance to make peace." He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as me. My pulse hammered in my ears. Every instinct screamed to send them away, to protect this fragile happiness. Yet as I looked at Emily beside me, calm and radiant, and at Margaret in the front row, her eyes wide with both concern and faith, I forced myself to breathe. I told myself I was no longer that frightened boy. I could withstand this. With a stiff nod, I allowed them to stay. Guests shuffled awkwardly as the three took their seats near the aisle. The officiant cleared his throat and began the ceremony, his voice trembling slightly as though he too felt the weight of the tension. Emily's hand in mine anchored me as vows were spoken and promises exchanged. I held her gaze, refusing to let the shadows in the crowd steal this moment from us. Still, I could feel Richard's presence like a blade at my back. He sat upright, his expression unreadable, eyes fixed not on his son's happiness, but on something colder, sharper. Elaine perched beside him with a smile too polished to be genuine, her pearls gleaming as though they belonged to another life. David fidgeted, his jaw tight, the role of peacekeeper already slipping from his shoulders. The ceremony moved forward, but every word carried an undercurrent of unease. I told myself I had overcome their cruelty, that nothing they could do would break me now. And yet, when the vows ended and the guests applauded, I dared a glance in Richard's direction. His eyes were locked on me, hard and unyielding, filled not with pride or even disdain, but something more dangerous, a cold, deliberate intent. In that moment, I realized the past wasn't finished with me. It had only been waiting for this stage, this day, to return with sharper teeth. The camera capturing the ceremony lingered on his face just long enough for me to see it clearly, the icy stare of a man who had not come to reconcile but to strike. The applause from the ceremony had barely settled into murmurs when the master of ceremonies invited the father of the groom to share a few words. My stomach clenched. I knew this moment was coming, but I had hoped Richard would remain silent, that perhaps his presence was nothing more than an empty gesture. Slowly he rose from his chair, buttoned his jacket, and walked with measured steps to the front. The microphone hissed softly as he adjusted it, his hand steady, his face unreadable. He looked out at the crowd, then turned his gaze on me. His voice carried with an icy precision. "Today is supposed to be a celebration," he began. "But I cannot celebrate, because the man standing here before you is not my son. He never was. A bastard like him doesn't deserve a wedding gift." The words cut through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the guests. The laughter, the warmth, the music all drained away as though someone had opened a door to winter. My legs weakened beneath me. Emily's grip on my hand tightened, but when I looked at her, I saw her face frozen in disbelief, her lips parted, her eyes wide with shock. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Richard let the pause stretch, savoring it. Then he lifted a small remote from his pocket. "And if any of you doubt me," he said, his tone sharpened by contempt, "I have proof." A screen flickered to life at the side of the reception hall. I hadn't even noticed it being wheeled in earlier. The crowd turned their heads as the video began to play. Grainy footage appeared, captured years ago in our home. There I was, a scrawny boy no older than 10, standing in the living room, my hands shaking as I tried to explain something. Elaine stormed into frame, her face twisted with rage. The sound came next, too loud, too sharp. The crack of her hand against my face echoed through the speakers, the microphone amplifying the violence. My younger self fell to the floor, curled up, covering my head, while her voice spat insults over and over. See, Richard's voice rang out over the horrified gasps. Even as a child, he was worthless, always weak, always pathetic. And you expect me to call that my son? My throat tightened. I wanted to shout, to tear the screen down, to silence the ghost of that boy. But I couldn't move. My arms hung limp at my sides, my body locked in place. The room blurred as tears welled in my eyes. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some covering their mouths, others glancing at one another in disbelief. Emily's hand trembled in mine, but when I turned, I saw tears sliding down her cheeks. Pain for me, not doubt, but it didn't soothe the wound. All I could see was the boy on the screen reliving the nightmare in front of everyone I loved. Shame flooded me hot and suffocating. My legs felt like stone. I stood there exposed, as though stripped of every scrap of dignity I had fought so hard to build. The sound of the video faded into silence, leaving only the echo of my humiliation hanging in the air. Richard lowered the remote, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. He had chosen his moment with precision, determined to shatter me where I stood. The crowd remained stunned, no one daring to break the silence. My chest heaved, but no words came. I could not fight him, not here, not now. I was trapped again, the same powerless boy who once cowered on the floor. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Margaret. She sat still in her chair, but her hand had tightened around the handle of her worn cloth bag, the knuckles white. Her eyes, however, were no longer sid with age. They burned with a fire I had never seen before, a storm gathering behind them. The camera, still rolling, lingered on her face, as though it too sensed the moment. In that silence, I knew something was about to change. For a moment after the screen went dark, the room was silent, every guest stunned into stillness. My body felt numb, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, with a steadiness that silenced the whispers beginning to reach, Margaret rose from her chair. She looked smaller than ever, her frame thin with age, but each step she took forward carried a weight that pulled every eye to her. She reached the front and stood facing Richard, who still held the microphone, his smirk barely faded. Her voice trembled at first, but the steel beneath it carried through the hall. "If you want truth, Richard, then let us tell all of it." From her cloth bag, she drew out a sealed envelope, its edges worn but intact. She pressed it into his hand. "Open it. Read it for yourself." Richard frowned, confusion flashing across his face. He tore the envelope open, unfolded the document, and as his eyes scanned the page, the color drained from his face. His lips parted soundlessly, the paper shook in his hands. A murmur swept through the guests, curious and uneasy. Margaret spoke again, louder now, her voice fueled by years of silence finally breaking. "That Richard is a DNA test, conducted 3 years ago, and it proves that David is not your son." Gasps filled the air like a wave crashing over the room. Richard's hands trembled as though the paper burned his skin, and Elaine leapt to her feet, her voice shrill. "Lies. It's fake, all of it. She's making this up." But Margaret was ready. With calm precision, she drew out more papers, photographs, and receipts, scattering them onto the table for all to see. Photos of Elaine with a man no one recognized, their intimacy undeniable. Receipts for hotel rooms and expensive dinners charged in secret. Letters written in Elaine's hand pleading with her lover to take her away. The evidence stacked higher and higher, impossible to ignore. Elaine's face turned white, then blotched red with fury. She screamed again, but her voice cracked, splintering under the weight of proof. The crowd leaned forward, some gasping, others whispering, eyes darting between Richard and Elaine. Then came a sound that cut through all of it. David's voice, raw and ragged. "You lied to me, Mom." His face was twisted in anguish as he stumbled toward Elaine. "All these years you told me he was my father. You let me believe I was his son." His chest heaved, tears breaking free. "You told me we were a family and it was all a lie. You even planned to leave with that man, didn't you?" Elaine tried to reach for him, but he recoiled as if her touch was poison. "Don't you dare," he spat, his voice shaking. The room pulsed with tension, a family unraveling in front of everyone. Richard staggered back from the table, the DNA papers slipping from his grasp and fluttering to the floor. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. His hand clutched at his chest. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then his knees buckled and he collapsed forward, crashing against the edge of the wedding table before falling to the floor. Shouts rang out, guests rising from their seats in panic. Someone screamed for an ambulance. Elaine shrieked, falling to her knees beside him, though whether from fear for him or for herself, no one could tell. David stood rooted in place, his eyes darting between his mother and the man he had once believed to be his father, his face a portrait of betrayal. Amid the chaos, I stood frozen, unable to move. Emily's hand slid into mine, her grip firm, grounding me. I squeezed back, holding on as though it were the only thing tethering me to reality. My eyes were wide, not from fear alone, but from the realization that the lies which had defined my life were unraveling faster than I could process. Around us, the guests whispered, shocked beyond words. But all I could feel was the heat of Emily's palm against mine and the echo of Margaret's fire still burning in the room. The sound of sirens had barely faded when the aftermath began to settle over everyone's lives like a suffocating fog. Richard survived the collapse at my wedding, but survival was far from victory. The doctor said the heart attack had left him partially paralyzed, unable to walk without assistance, and robbed of the commanding presence he once used to dominate everyone around him. He returned to the grand house on St. Catherine Street, but it was no longer a home filled with parties and respectability. It became a prison of silence where he sat by the window in a wheelchair, staring at the empty street outside while a nurse came and went, the only company he had. Neighbors who had once nodded with admiration now crossed the street to avoid meeting his eye. His name no longer commanded respect. It stirred whispers. Elaine's fall was no less severe, though hers was marked by disgrace rather than infirmity. Richard wasted no time in filing for divorce, and with the truth of her affair exposed so publicly, no lawyer could soften the blow. She lost not only the marriage but the life she had built upon appearances. The women she once hosted for teas turned their backs. The clubs where she had held influence closed their doors. Even the grocery store felt hostile as whispers followed her down every aisle, her once polished smile replaced by a hollow mask. Elaine retreated into the crumbling house, her curtains drawn tight, the shine of pearls and silks replaced by shadows. David, caught between the ruins of both his parents, carried a different kind of burden. The revelation of his true parentage broke him in a way no one had anticipated. He left town soon after the wedding, taking little more than a suitcase. Rumors trickled back, sightings of him in distant cities, nights spent in bars, the glass always close at hand. Without the foundation he had believed in, he turned to the bottle to numb the weight of betrayal. He had been raised as the favored son, only to discover his entire identity was built on lies. His absence from the town became just another whispered reminder of what had happened to the Turners. For me and Emily, the story unfolded differently. The same guests who had sat in silence during my humiliation came forward afterward, their voices full of compassion. One after another, they said the words I had never thought I would hear. "You deserve better." Their hands squeezed my shoulders, their eyes full of kindness rather than judgment. For the first time, I realized the truth had not destroyed me, it had set me free. The lies that had bound me since childhood had unraveled, and instead of pity, people saw resilience. Emily stood at my side through every word, every embrace, and in her eyes I saw pride rather than sorrow. Grandma Margaret remained the steady anchor, her frail hand clasping mine as if to remind me that no matter how much had been lost, love was still present. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the walls of that reception hall. Lewisburg was a small town, and small towns carried secrets like wildfire. At the diner, in the church pews, at the barber's chair, people leaned close and whispered, "The Turners were never what they seemed." The name that once commanded admiration now summoned only scandal. The house on St. Catherine Street became a symbol not of wealth, but of downfall. I listened to the whispers only once as I passed by on an errand, hearing the pity in their voices, the disbelief that such a respected family had lived in such rot. Then I let them go. Their story was theirs to tell, but mine was moving forward. Still, the weight of that truth lingered in the air of the town. A reminder that facades always crack, and that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually demand their reckoning. In the weeks that followed the public unraveling of the Turner family, I found myself standing at the edge of a life I had never dared to imagine. With Emily's hand firmly in mine and Grandma Margaret's quiet encouragement behind us, we bought a small house in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. It wasn't grand or impressive by any means, just a modest 2-story with a slanted roof, a patch of green yard, and a porch that caught the morning sun, but to me it was more than a house. It was proof that I had broken free of the shadows that had haunted me for so long. Margaret moved in with us not long after, her things fitting neatly into a cozy room we had prepared with her favorite armchair and a view of the garden. On the first evening, she sat by the window knitting quietly while Emily and I set the table. I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in my life, dinner wasn't a battlefield. It was laughter, gentle teasing, the clink of cutlery, and the warmth of being wanted. Our little garden quickly became a sanctuary. Emily planted roses, I built a small wooden fence, and Margaret insisted on growing tomatoes. On summer evenings, we sat outside as the sun dipped low, watching the plants sway in the breeze while cicadas sang in the trees. There were no harsh words, no cutting glances, no sense of not belonging. There was only peace. Then one day an envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting was unmistakable, Richard's. I stood by the kitchen counter staring at it for a long time before finally tearing it open. His words were shaky, written by a man broken by time and truth. He apologized for the years of cruelty, for the silence that had cut deeper than any blow. He asked for forgiveness, said he wished to see me once more before his health gave out. I read every word carefully, then folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. My silence was my answer. I did not hate him anymore, but I would not return. Some wounds cannot be healed by late regrets. Months later came an unexpected knock at our door. When I opened it, David stood there, older than his years. Eyes red-rimmed and weary. He looked smaller, without the arrogance that had once clung to him like armor. His voice cracked as he said, "I'm sorry, Michael. For everything. I didn't know, and I let them use me against you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I had to say it." I listened, the weight of years pressing on me. Memories of his smirks, his careless words, and the divide between us flickered through my mind. I took a long breath and shook my head gently. "I can't forgive you now," I said softly. "But maybe someday." His shoulders slumped, but he nodded as though even that sliver of hope was more than he deserved. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway with a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. Time moved forward as it always does, and with it came the greatest blessing of my life. Emily placed our newborn daughter into my arms one quiet morning, her tiny fingers curling instinctively around mine. As I held her close, feeling the warmth of her breath against my chest, tears blurred my vision. Margaret sat nearby, her smile radiant despite her frailty, and Emily leaned into my shoulder, exhausted but glowing with joy. In that moment, everything fell into place. I looked at my daughter, so pure, untouched by the pain of the past, and I whispered a vow that came from the deepest part of my soul. I would never let her feel the loneliness I had known. She would grow up surrounded by love, respect, and truth. My voice broke as I spoke the words that had become the lesson of my life. Family is not blood. Family is love, respect, and truth. As Michael closed the chapter on the Turner legacy, what remained was not bitterness but strength. He had built a home with Emily and welcomed Margaret into the warmth she had always given him. The shadows of betrayal and cruelty were replaced by laughter at the dinner table and the cries of his newborn daughter. The story began with rejection, humiliation, and pain, but it ended with love, resilience, and truth. It reminds us that family is not determined by bloodlines or appearances, but by the people who stand by us when the world turns away. And now I want to turn this over to you. What would you have done in Michael's place? Would you have forgiven Richard, Elaine, or David, or walked away forever? Your voice matters, and I would love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched you, if it made you angry or gave you hope, please take a moment to subscribe. By joining, you'll be part of a community that shares stories of hardship, redemption, and resilience. Don't just watch, add your perspective below, and let's keep the conversation alive.